Welcome to another Turnstile Tours program, a virtual program. I'm Stefan DW, and I'm coming to you from Flushing here in the lands that used to be those of the Lenape and on the edge of New York City out in center of Queens. And once again, talking about waterfront things, as I often do. And today, I couldn't be more excited about our topic. I'm a native of Staten Island and have been able to see the Statue of Liberty in the Staten Island Ferry from my bedroom window as an adult and as a child. And today we are talking about the Staten Island Ferry. Of course, we're having this conversation because it's been in the news lately as some famous people recently acquired a very recently retired Staten Island Ferry, which happens to be the particular boat that is nearest and dearest to my heart. We all have our favorites, those of us who have taken the ferry to work and school and have had as a big part of our lives. And the JFK, the John F. Kennedy Staten Island ferry boat, is a favorite of many of us. We'll talk about why with Angus McCamy, who is in the waterfront world of New York City, and his main occupation, and he'll tell us all about this, is as an engineer. He makes sure that the boats are working structurally and mechanically, and so he knows the JFK about as well as one can. Before we bring Angus in, I want to just take a quick glance at the history of the ferry. And typically when people talk about the Staten Island Ferry, they begin the history around 1810 with Cornelius Vanderbilt. The history of ferries in New York goes back all the way to 1642. And that's the earliest charter we have designating a ferry, and that ferry did go from Brooklyn to Manhattan, Cornelius Dirksen, but Cornelius Vanderbilt's kind of a bigger name, so we tend to focus on him. 1810, he got his own boat, the pirogue Swiftsure, and used that to transport people largely between Staten Island and Manhattan, but also did a lot of work for the transporting goods and materials to the forts in the lead up to the War of 1812. And that's really where his career began. And he continued to be involved in ferries even after they became steam ferries. That pirogue was just sails and oars. There's a really common type of boat you see all over the world, heavily built and pretty easy to maneuver. But steam navigation came to Staten Island 3 years after it came to the ferry between Brooklyn and Manhattan, and the Staten Island ferries went steam in 1817. From 1853 to 1864, we had 3 or 4 different Staten Island ferry companies offering service between the island and Manhattan, and they began to consolidate. By 1883, those consolidated ferries were taken over by the B&O Railroad, which we talked a little bit about on our program, looking at the North Shore of Staten Island and people like Erastus Wyman. And we also talked about the B&O Railroad with our program that looked at the connection, the freight connection from Staten Island to New Jersey, and the lift bridge over the Arthur Kill. That B&O Railroad service of the ferry system ended in 1905, partly as a result of a terrible disaster on the Westfield ferry, which exploded just off of the battery. But to talk about the JFK, the particular boat that we're focused on today, that history is a little shorter. JFK and its sister ships were constructed in 1965. This is 1 year after the Verrazano Narrows Bridge opened. Of course, the modern history of Staten Island, the current history of Staten Island, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge is the big game changer. And that Staten Island had been a very rural place. It was a bunch of farming communities. And with the opening of that bridge, it spurred a huge population growth in the island. And the JFK, just retired last year, saw almost all of that growth. That was the ferry that connected people from Staten Island during the time of its greatest growth to Manhattan. And we'll talk, of course, wasn't the only boat operating that, the only class of boats operating at that time. We'll talk more about the other boats and Angus's memories of those. And it wasn't the only boat operating in the harbor. As late as 1967, there were other ferries. The Erie-Lackawanna Ferry ended its service at that time, connecting New Jersey to Manhattan. And for the next 19 years, the Staten Island Ferry was the only service in the harbor for commuters, for passengers. 1987, the last steam ferries retired from Staten Island Ferry service, and that was just a year. It was about the same time that we saw the New York Waterway start to restore other services to the harbor beyond the Staten Island Ferry. And then, of course, 2021, the Staten Island Ferry JFK finally retired, and earlier this year sold at auction. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to the people who bought the JFK, who, based on absolutely no evidence whatsoever, I assume are watching this program and going to learn all about that boat. And here they are, the boats that were the fleet of the Staten Island ferries until the new Angus ferry, which initiated service on Friday, came into the fleet. But this was for the last decade or two. These were the types of ferries that you saw here. So this is the John F. Kennedy over on our left, and from 1965. This is the Barbary class ferries, which came in '87. The Austin class ferries, the Alice Austin and John Noble, which mostly operate at night. They're little ferries. And then the Monterey class ferries here, which came in early in this century and continue operating today. And with that, I'm going to drop our slides for a moment, and we'll invite Angus McCamy to join us here.
Hello.
All right, great.
Excellent.
Got lots of people chiming in the chat here. Angus, where are I love the painting behind you. That brings back memories from my childhood riding the ferry. Tell us about this painting behind you?
Well, that happens when you work at a ferry. A friend of mine found it in the trash someplace and said, "I know who could use this," and brought it in to me, and I put it on the wall here in the office. It's the JFK class ferries, showing the old shoe shine men at their work. It's I've seen that image before. I guess it got put up places, but it was nicely framed. I'm like, I think it's pertinent to this talk.
Yeah, absolutely. The memories that brings back. I don't know how old I was when I finally understood what they were saying. I thought for years they were saying shank, shank. As they
yeah, it was everything from chine, because they were immigrants, and everybody. The stories were that they had piles and piles of money, even though they looked like derelicts and just shined shoes, because it was so lucrative. I don't know how true that was, but I certainly remember as a kid, the shoe shine guys in the terminals and then on the boats. So it's just I don't know, it's a classic for the growing up in the city and going to the ferries, which I mean, every New Yorker probably has done at some point or another, whether they realized it or not at the time.
And you are a native New Yorker, right? Where are you from?
I actually was born in Wisconsin, but from the age of 2 onwards, grew up in Lower Manhattan, and one of those parts of doing that was that it was a short walk downtown, where my mom there was 4 of us, would walk us downtown to the ferry. She had a 20-minute break, not having to watch the kids all the time because they were safe and couldn't get too far, and then take us to a walk to the pool and then back, and that was a day, and we were completely tired, and she could rest for the rest of the day.
That's the
instead of having kids running around.
Over just less than a mile from the ferry there, right?
Yeah, Tompkins pool there, which I don't think it's been open for a while.
No, it's in pretty bad shape. The last time I saw it, it was beautiful. One of these sort of Robert Moses kind of Art Deco feeling places, all the brickwork and the big curves. But yeah, I see in the chat there's some people saying that they think it had a rough time in Sandy. But it's right behind Miller's Launch there, the tugboat company, and they definitely had a lot of water there. So,
well, all the waterfronts of that storm, put the old little tanker up on the beach down there. It destroyed the Staten Island, got absolutely smashed in that storm.
We hopefully we'll make time to check in your memories about Sandy. But you said you work for the ferries, and I mentioned that you're an engineer. In your what is it that you do exactly?
Yeah, how does that happen? What is it? What do I do? Well, as an engineer on the boat, it's you start the engines, you keep them running, you start them again when they stop, which on the old JFK class had a tendency to do, and make sure the electricity is working so that people do it, and despite and make sure all the sewage gets treated properly before it gets put over the side, and that can be a chore in itself on a rush trip in the morning. So that's the general thing. I like to say it's, keeping, making noise and making sure there's oil everywhere, because then at least they're getting lubricated. And so it's a lot of oil drips around on old boats. So that's keep them noisy and keep them oiled. That's the basic job of the engineer, and also to be on call when something happens up top, or the heat. We also have to provide heat to the ferries in the wintertime, and it's hot down there in the summertime. So
Oh, I remember very well. Of course, the JFK has a car deck on it, which hasn't been used since 9/11, as far as I know, and not for the public at least. And I remember as a child the heat coming up from the engine room. There were a couple of hatches in the car deck, and it was just unbearable to even walk past it.
yeah, so there's a certain smell of I like to call it old paint, bilge water, diesel, and oil that is very common throughout vessels. It doesn't change a little bit. Each vessel smells a little differently, but and in the heat, it's a thick smell that doesn't go away. It's still there on the boat. I walk down there, it comes right to mind. You can tell right away. Right away, you know how old the boat is just by how it smells. So
yeah, no, I know exactly what you're talking about there. Well, let's talk about some older boats. So I've been referring to my childhood memories of the JFK. What are your earliest memories of the Staten Island ferries?
well, like I said, it was walking downtown with my brothers and sisters, but the biggest thing then was we didn't want to get on the new boats at the time, the JFK American Legion and the Herman Lehman. We wanted the Miss New York or the steamboats or the Verrazano, because we're like, that's the one that's going to give us the best ride, because the ride was all about the end crashing into the racks. And in knowing the engineering now behind it, it truly was a controlled crash. The captain would pull her out of gear, out beyond the slip, coast in a little bit, give the signal. And this is the crazy thing in the old days. He'd give a signal with bells down to the engine room. The engineer would answer the bell, put the engines into reverse for a certain period of time until he got the bell to take it out of gear. So it was basically all ahead, all stop, half astern, stop, and then quarter astern, bang into the bridge, and then quarter ahead. And that was how you brought the ferry in, but it means crashing into the rack. And that's where the fun was as a kid. The creaking and the groaning and getting slammed from one side to the other. It was a ride. Back then, people fell down all the time. the signs were put up there because it was a ride. And nowadays, we touch the racks, people complain. They didn't have to be one back then.
No,
that's my earliest memories of the Staten Island ferry.
So you mentioned the bells and you mentioned taking things out of gear. We had a question: how does that differ from it, and how does that differ from how the controls are on the diesel?
Well, with now the JFK, looking at that timeline is kind of interesting, because the ferries the new diesel electric ferries come online at the same time as the bridge. And it takes several years to build a ferry and a few years to decide what kind of ferry to build. And it took 10 years to get to the point to build the new Aulis, and then 4 years for them to build it. It's 15 years. So it's kind of interesting. The bridge was being built and they were designing new ferries. So the diesel electric is different than the steam. The steam was controlled by the engine crew or the chief actually switching gears on the engine, stopping it, starting it, and running the throttle. And so he had to get a signal from the bridge down called a bell on a telegraph. You'll see those old ship telegraphs, and ring them like that. Well, it's a similar thing. But on the new diesels, they can run the wire up top to the bridge, and now the captain can have direct control of the engines himself. So the chief down below doesn't really have to worry about, does he give more gas or less gas or fuel to the engines? The captain has complete control of that now, and it's a finer control because he can give it just a little bit. I mean, imagine driving a car from the back seat and say, okay, push on the pedal. No, take off a little bit. Eventually you get down to like half pedal, please, a quarter pedal, please. And then you'd find that system. Take it out of gear and you coast, okay, now apply the brake. That's what the captains would have to do, but just with these bell signals. Now he has intuitive control from his eyes, his hands. He steers the wheel and he runs the engines at the same time. That's the big difference. And that's carried on to the new ones.
Yeah, and now I had the privilege of being able to tour some of the ferries a few years ago, and I was shocked to see that you've referred to the telegraph. And I think we've got a photo of what you're talking about here, which I'll try to pull up for you in just a second. But you refer to the telegraph. It's not like a telegraph in the sort of the Morse code sense of telegraph. It's a different thing entirely. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, that would be called actually an engine order telegraph. And
right. Actually, now this is the throttle we're looking at over here, right?
That would be the engine order telegraph in the bridge of the Kennedy. And so when he takes one of those, the lever, he can push it forward and it engages the throttle. He pushes it forward and it gauges forward and reverse. So you have throttle and forward and reverse.
But even on the Molinari class, there is an engine order telegraph. It's made of plastic, but it's there. It's why
now. Well, see, if you were to see a half circle all the way to the right of that picture outboard, that's actually a traditional engine order telegraph where when he turns a handle there, it repeats down below the signal that he gives up top. So if he pushes the position in one direction, it indicates that position down below in the engine room. Now, the strange part about this is Staten Island ferries are double-ended, so you kind of have two bows. There's no reverse, so to speak, in the or no astern. So we on the ferries, here's you have the New York end and you have the Staten Island end. And but traditionally on a ship, you have a bow and you have a stern. So it's a funny way of indicating which direction you go, but that's what it is. Down in the engine room, instead of forward or reverse or forward and astern, it's New York or Staten Island, a little arrow that points, and that means we're going to Staten Island, and that's the Staten Island end. And that's the control where the which pilot house has control.
I've noticed that as a passenger, you see labels in parts of the boat. You don't have a port or starboard. You have a New Jersey and a Brooklyn.
Right. I mean, how confusing would it be? Please, and most of the commands are, police officers to the starboard side. They wouldn't know where to go. No one would know where to go. Go to the Brooklyn side. Everybody knows where that is, and it won't change. Even if you turn the ferry around, you'll still have a Brooklyn and Jersey side, which it's a safety issue. In the end, it becomes a safety issue, but it's a strange animal in terms of maritime nomenclature. So I'm used to things on my right side being the Brooklyn side, and things on my left side are Jersey. But I can easily, but that doesn't work when I am, say, going to Staten Island. So it's one of those odd things about the ferries.
So when did you start working on the ferries?
It will be 21 years ago, 1999. A strange set of circumstances brought me into contact with two deckhands, and I ended up on the ferry. Not realize, I thought it's like, okay, maybe I give it a shot. I'd been going to sea, working on the tugboats, had this career sailing away. And the last thought in my mind was staying ashore in New York Harbor, on the Staten Island Ferry. That's for when you retire. And but it seemed to fit. It seemed to work. I got there. It started to be fun. I actually really enjoyed it. Worked with some really good crews, and at this point, I'm already married and going away for 6 months, 2 months, 2 weeks. That's not very much fun. So it's like, well, this is a good job now. So that's how I
Going away
started.
because you'd be going to sea for a time.
Yeah, when you go, as a young man, going to sea was fantastic. See the land, see the world, friends here, friends there. It was a lot of fun. Coming back, at the time, my parents still had a place in the city, so I could come home. I could stay at home for a month or two without having to worry about rent, and then find the next job would come along, and that sounds like fun. I'll go to Italy, or they want me out in the Pacific, I'll go out to the Pacific. So it was a sort of a charmed life that way. But when you start having to have a real home and start paying real rent and all that, it makes sense, if you're going to be doing that, to stay and live there, not have it empty. And plus, with a relationship that says, I don't want to be away, or so we made it. We made the transition from me being away to me being home every day, which is different, but a better one. So.
Well, so you talked about what it means to be an engineer and the noise and the oil. We had a question from Alex. What about the rest of the crew? Who are the other people you're working with on the boat?
Okay, and on the ferries, we have 4 crew members in the engine room. You got the chief, you got a marine engineer or the assistant, and then 2 oilers. I started as an oiler, moved up to the assistant position or marine engineer, and then became chief engineer. So that's in the engine room, and we kind of keep to ourselves down there. Depending on the crew, you have captain, an assistant captain. Well, excuse me. Depending on the crew is how much the engine crew and the above deck crew interrelate. Sometimes we want to let them stay up there and we'll stay down below. We don't want to talk to them, or they don't want to talk to us. Depends. An age-old issue of engineers, put it that way. Because engineers always are right, and the captain never knows what he's doing, you see. So sometimes that causes friction.
I've always wondered about that. I'm glad you got me straightened out about it, because I heard the reverse. So.
Well, I mean, there's yes, of course. I'm sure, from the captain's point of view, engineers are totally unnecessary and just, get in the way all the time and know too much. They think they know everything. So who wants that around you either? So I sympathize. So yeah, you have the captain, assistant captain, and then 2 mates and a bunch of deckhands. Frankly, I don't count them. The different vessels have different numbers of deckhands. I count myself lucky, having worked with some fantastic people at the ferry, where we all kind of are in sympathy with, we have a job to do, we get the job done, and we try to laugh at life that exists, not worry about who's doing this or who's not doing that, and this person, that person, and the gossip channels of people who want to idle minds. Maybe that's what it is. And so we work with some fun people, and we've despite the monotony of going back and forth, you can have a fun day. One of the reasons I became an engineer and decided to stay was it didn't on the engine in the ferries was that as an engineer, it doesn't matter where I'm going. The engines still have to go around. They have to make noise, and I have to give them oil. It doesn't matter whether I'm going across the ocean or going across the harbor. The job is the same. On the ferry, it's a little better because I get to go home at night after 8 hours or 10 hours. I'm off the clock. I'm off the boat. When you go to sea, you might be off the clock, but you're still on the ship. And so it's, you're on call 24/7. and you're doing that for 6 months, three to 6 months at a time, it gets tiring, and if you have a good crew, it's fantastic. If you have a bad crew, it can be a long time, a long time. So, yeah.
Question from Maryland. Are women employed by the Staten Island Ferry?
Yes, they are. We have a couple chief engineers. We've had at least 2 chief engineers. We still have one now, women. We've had women captains, ACs. And now we have several deckhands in the last 10 years, a lot more. Even 20 years ago, there was at least one assistant captain. Back then, no engineers that I'm aware of, but now it's very common, and for the most part, I would say hands down better. Every ship I've sailed on that has had women in the crew, it's always been a better crew. And the few times I've had men only, entire ship of men, it wasn't as fun. I don't know why, but that's just that's my experience. It's always it levels the playing field and keeps everybody's just happier, I find.
Well, we got some more questions about crews, but I do want to get into the boat itself. We came here to talk about, and here it is, the John F. Kennedy with the Verrazano Narrows Bridge in the background and Bay Ridge. And so we'll just take a couple of look at a couple of these photos of the boat as we're looking at what sets this boat apart for you.
Well, now in hindsight, I think is the style of it is an older style. The open decks on the hurricane deck, as in this picture, is clear. You can see clearly through the windows to the other side. The step back from the actual ends to the saloon deck and then up to the bridge deck and the pilot house, that's just it's a sleeker sort of step feel to me aesthetically. And then of course the stack is a more modern stack compared to the steamboats, the older steamboats with the straight smokestack. And JFK has the Marine and Aviation emblem on the stack, which was old department that the city ran their ferries, Marine and Aviation, from the airports to the ferries. I guess
I'm always fascinated where that turns up, whether it's on piers, on the Hudson, or at Floyd Bennett Field. It's fascinating, the little corners where the Department of Marine and Aviation had their thumbprint.
Yeah, well, it's all the airports we used to have, and what Port Authority is now.
I've always wondered, what about these smaller stacks on here?
That's ventilation for the engines. So the engines have these big fans, and they take in air to help cool the actual generators. And so can be a lot of carbon from the brushes in there build up, so that it serves two purposes. It keeps the engine room technically cleaner, although after 60 years it's pretty dirty. And then it provides cooling air, so it takes the air down and pushes it back up. And you have two motor rooms, fore and after, Staten Island, New York motor rooms. Because the engines, you have four main engines, 4 generators, and then 8 motors. So it's basically split in half. For each end has its own propulsion system. There's 2 propellers, but in the middle there, it's not a common shaft. It's 2 separate propulsion plants.
Gotcha. Slightly off topic here. Catherine wants to know, did you have a favorite time of day on the boat? And were there daily trips that were better or worse than others? So we look at a couple of photos of American Legion here.
I when starting out as an oiler, the first year, you go wherever they tell you to go. You didn't have a choice. And someone went on vacation or got sick, and so they assigned me to the JFK. And yeah, it was the JFK, and it was the afternoon shift, and that one was from 3 o'clock in the afternoon to about 2 o'clock in the morning. It was horrible. Those hours I didn't like at all. So excuse me. But the one part about it, it was a deadhead trip from Staten Island. So you get in, I would get in, do my checks, make my rounds, and then I could take a cup of coffee and sit up on the passenger deck, usually right on this deck, the saloon deck right in the front there, and take a ride across the harbor on my own boat. I mean, it was, totally peaceful. No one else around. All the deckhands are just taking their break. And I sat out there going, this is pretty good. And sip my coffee just before we get into Whitehall, get back down to the engine room, report to the chief, all's good. That got me through the few months I was on that boat for that shift. I'd sit in one of those seats right there.
That sounds idyllic.
It was my own private ferry across the harbor for 20 minutes. And then it turned into the rush, because, the afternoon shift, the rush trip was, everybody just starts, piles of people coming on. Classic.
Yeah. And we got of course, the
and just so everybody knows, don't eat in the food port there on the JFK. That was just not a good place to eat. Oh, you don't have to worry about it anymore.
No. Mary says, love the wooden benches. Everybody loves the wooden benches except for the Coast Guard, unfortunately. So I know that was a real point of contention. It's always an issue with the ferry boats, and trying to make sure the benches are comfortable and aesthetically pleasing. Do you have any particular memories of why do you say don't eat at the snack bar?
Because when there's something had to go, they didn't have power, there wasn't any water, something was going wrong with the machines, I'd have to go up there and climb underneath there. It was never clean. There's syrup from, the soda machines, there's stale coffee, dead hot dogs. Well, not that the hot dog's supposed to be alive, but I mean, you had to crawl underneath the counter, undo whatever was supposed to be done, and then get back out, and it was horrible. And I'm like, I'm not going to eat up here. And some crews loved it. They're like, the concession people were very happy, and it's like, yeah, give the guys hot dogs. I'm like, no thanks, no thanks. Every once in a while, okay, I'll take a cup of coffee, thank you.
And of course, those outside decks, everybody loved, and those big wooden benches up there. We had a couple questions here about this is sort of a big question hanging over these, and talking about the snack bar not being a problem anymore. Do you have any sense from your perspective about how viable it is to turn this into something else? What do you see as the challenges of taking a boat of this type and making it a public venue space?
Well, I've worked with historic vessels in the past, and I've seen a lot of conversions done, both in the States and overseas. So my attitude is any vessel that floats is viable for something, and any vessel that floats it's either a warship, or it's a yacht, or it's making money for its owners. And if it can't do any of those three things, then just get rid of it. So JFK floats, so you should be able to make money with it. How to do that? The sky's the limit. And you can do so much. There's so much space on there. It's amazing. But you got to keep it from sinking. And what do you dream? I see a lot of potential for the boat. So I'm looking forward to see what happens there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just a couple last shots here of the boat on the sort of the places that people may be familiar with. I was always fascinated by this particular part here on the main deck, and you can see that there's been some renovation here, that there's a change in the fence line. And when I was a kid, this little section of fence that's sort of at right angles extended all the way across and had chains coming down. And if I recall correctly, deckhands could just throw the big fence up, and a little fence over here was connected to it so that it also went up. And these fences flew up in the air to clear the way for a lot of time cars going across. And my parents did lock the keys in the car on the ferry at one time. Max was involved in solving that problem, but yeah, that's a nightmare.
Well,
And then, of course, yeah,
go ahead.
I gather, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that this is partly after they stopped having regular car traffic on the ferry that they made this switch to the fences you see here.
Yeah, the columns that you see there, where the chains would go into, had counterweights to help lift what they called smash gates. And they had, instead of these ones which is accordion in and out, these articulated up in the air, like you said, but they would come down with a crash, even though they were counterweighted, because you wanted to keep them down. But there were also, you also still had to do some lifting. So I think a combination of you don't have people right at the end anymore. I think there was injuries involved, and the getting to the counterweights becomes impossible. So it's like, okay, we're going to these accordion gates. I do remember my dad, we took the car a couple times across to the Staten Island ferry. And I remember one time he's like, I don't know how he managed it, but we waited for the next boat, and he was able to get on right in the front, right in the center in the front. And he's like, now watch this. And we're like, what do you mean? What do you mean? He's like, watch, I'm steering the ferry. And he went to steer. And we're like, oh, that's so cool.
A magical childhood memory. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And there's the view going the other way with the car deck. And I do want to get on to sort of your perspective on the ferry and interior. So here we're getting into your shots in just a moment here as we look at more of the main deck. And this is inside, and here are parts of the ferry that people don't normally get to see. So what are we looking at here?
Okay, well, this is the Brooklyn side main deck, and then underneath the outboard seats, we had to remove all them, was rusted steel with holes in it. And so upon inspection, the Coast Guard says, that looks like rusted steel. How thick is it? And we go, I don't know, I think it's thick enough. And they say, well, prove it to me. And so then we take ultrasonic readings, and tells us exactly how thick it is. And if it's beyond 25%, Coast Guard says, cut it out and remove it. So we had to cut it out and remove it. And that's what was that. So the gray area you see is the new steel, and they've got 3 pieces in. They're getting ready to fit up the last one. So after that's all put in, some insulation goes back, gets all painted, insulation goes back, and then we put the seats back.
And here we have a really dramatic view, almost so very few people have seen, looking up from underneath the boat. So we're at Cadell, or well, a dry dock. I don't know if this is
no, it's Cadell dry dock, dry dock number 6. So about five years ago now, I was asked to join the shipyard crew to oversee the repairs, and I said absolutely, sure. I love shipyards. Every ship I've worked on, I've been in. So this was my chance to work on a ferry in the shipyard. And she had some damage to the rail after 50 years of smashing into the racks. And there some cracks developed. So Coast Guard said, you got to repair it. And we said, okay. And this is what you're seeing as part of the repair. The rudder is sitting down on the deck underneath. We had to take that apart. Oh no, excuse me. That's a rudder to the Molinari class. Sorry.
This is over here.
Yeah, that's a Molinari class rudder that was being worked on too at the same time.
Here. So you talked about smashing into the racks, and this looks like where the action happens here.
Yep, so they've removed the old piece. The clean bluish gray is the new steel that was cut and put in, because these sections it's a 1/2 inch steel, were all deformed, looked like kind of a big fat noodle, been just bent in and deformed all the way in. And that's after it's 16 inches tall there, and the channel is about 1.5 inches thick. And that got deformed. So it was over time. What happens once the steel starts to bend, and repeated bend hits at the same time, each time it just kind of continues on. It's slow but steady repair, damage, and at some point it just has to be done. And we did that, and some other steel, as you'll see some other pictures. Because at this point in 2018, she should have been retired already. And we were waiting on the other ferries to come up, and we didn't know, so we have to repair it. And this repair is good for 5 years before the next big inspection. And now that won't have to happen. So we pull off the propellers. The propeller was pulled off. The pink is the testing. We test all the edges for cracks. We pulled the shafts. Then we clean them all up, and we put them back. And the last picture is, bright, shiny new propeller. Well, clean anyway. Not new.
And this piece over here, is this what you were talking about before with the pieces you're replacing?
Yeah, you see the light gray on the rail just on the car deck. That's the piece that got replaced, and that was they bought 2 of them. They probably got a deal, got 2 for 1, and you never know. Maybe the other end is bad too. But so that was that's the extra spare piece. So
and Mary wants to know the maintenance contract that she said recalls, is that competitively bid? Do the ferries sometimes go to other yards besides Cadell on the North Shore of Staten Island?
Yes, they do. When I first started in the shipyard crew here, we would go all the way. We take these boats. 2015, I was down. First shipyard period was down in Kiwanis Shipyard in Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia. And we had the JFK and the Molinari out at the same time in the same dock. That was my introduction to what we're seeing here. So that was a competitive bid. 5 years later, the bid goes out again, and this time Cadell wins it. And so we've been in Cadells now for that period. In another year or so, another bid will go out, and we'll see what happens then. There's really 3 yards that can bid. It's the 2 in New York, Brooklyn Navy Yard, and Cadells, and then Virginia. So there's not, there are other places she could go, but those people are not going to bid on the work.
I'm really struck by this photo here on the right. What are these circles that we're seeing underneath the deck?
Yes, those are access ports to you saw the underneath where the channel was being, as a previous slide, these slots, and those are empty spaces called void spaces. So you can open up the void space, climb inside, and get out to the end to weld the inside of the rail that was being repaired. So they're kind of enclosed spaces that have, you don't want water hanging out up there and splashing up there, so they enclose them all. So access ports.
Got it. So another view of the propeller.
Now, so here's that's the final look of, there's probably a picture when she was first built, and it's going to look like that. The picture on the left with the brand new propeller. That's after she's been nicely painted. But we had to put in a patch of steel where you see those guys pushing on the piece of steel. It's hanging by a chain fall, and they're trying to get it fitted into place. We had to cut that out, and that's in a extremely tight space where the shaft comes through the hull into the inside of the boat, and there's a seal, packing gland, and we had to get inside there and weld all around that. It was a big job. It's a very, very tight space, extra thick steel, And it's also where all the water sits from the shaft. The shaft leaks on a regular basis. It's designed that way to provide cooling, but as a result, the salt water hangs out in there too long. For too long, after 50 years, it gets rusty, and the steel gets thin, and then the Coast Guard says you got to replace it. Or
Yeah,
ABS, American Bureau of Shipping, also.
A place. I know the packing seal's a bit from wooden boats, and it's at such a key spot. You have so many pressures and going on there. You have to have flexibility with the shaft being able to turn, and therefore you have water intrusion, but you don't want water in the boat. And there's so much going on in that spot. It's
well, it's the same thing. It's the same kind of packing. It's the 16-inch shaft with greased flax packing that you back and then you tighten up. Instead of 2 bolts, it's 6 or 8 bolts. So it's 6 bolts. So it's the same principle. It's just bigger. Instead of 1/4-inch packing, it's a 1-inch packing. And one of the jobs as an oiler was to go down there, not when she was running. Well, hopefully not when she's running. I mean, there was a few times it was leaks too much, and you're getting in there and you get soaking wet trying to tighten it up, and that's when you're cursing the previous crew that didn't tighten it up. But that's just par for the course, I guess, as they say.
I think we got a couple more photos of some welding patches here. And Catherine asks, what was it like taking the ferry from Virginia to New York? What was it like taking a Staten Island ferry on the ocean?
You'll need to ask the cockroaches. No one rides the ferry going down. It's towed down by a tugboat. She gets closed up. Windows get closed up with plywood, and they take it away. So when it leaves the pier, we say goodbye, and when we see it arrive, that's when she arrives. No one rides the boat down there. So, I would suspect it's quiet, dark, and cold because there's no power.
And that's how they're coming up here. They're also towed up because they're built. The new ones that are coming in are built in, is it Louisiana or Alabama?
The new ferry, the oldest class, built down in Panama City, Florida. The JFK class was built in Livingston, Louisiana. I don't know if they were steamed up or towed up. Probably would have steamed them up just because that was probably easier to do back then. It's like, hey, what the hell, But I don't know. I don't know if they were towed up or not. It depends on the contract.
Another place for some research. So is this the same patch? These are different patches we're looking at here. What are we seeing here?
Yeah, these are different patches. These are right around in and around the engine room. Again, makes sense because in the engine room has the most area where water has the ability to get into, because it's either dripping from above from leaking toilets, or it's coming up through the sea chest or leaking cooling lines that are in the engine room. So that's where you're going to have the most corrosion because of that. And you find it, you section out areas and say, okay, the one with the 2 patches, the upper patch, you see a dark square, that is actually the sea chest that allows cooling water into the vessel in a controlled fashion. And so that's open to the water. And so we had to cut around that.
And these photos we're looking at, these are all from 2018. So was that the last major haul out for the JFK?
Yes, that would be her last dry docking. Now this kind of shows you, this is down looking inside to the Jersey side underneath the little tank, which holds the toilet stuff from engine room crew and below deck toilets, the deckhands locker room and the engineer's locker room. And so it's a dark place as indicated with my 2 fingers. And then you have to climb inside there, underneath there, to inspect it. And I believe that's underneath there is where one of those plates was actually, we had to cut that out. So you have to get down there, inspect it, realize, oh, there's stuff that needs to be done, tell the Coast Guard, tell the shipyard work needs to happen down there, and then crawl back down there once they tell you that it's done, and you know that it hasn't been. You climb in there and say, it needs to be done. It's not done. Oh yeah, no, I was just down there. It's not. And then they finish it. Then you go back down and inspect it. So every dark hole you're in 3 or 4 times just to do that. It's about 3.5, 4 feet down. And if it weren't for the light of the camera, it would be pitch black.
So it's now been 4 years since you were down in those holes. What did it look like when you were down there last, and what kind of shape is it in now?
It's in a lot better shape than she was. Each dry docking you treat as its own. It's not like we can say, oh, we're getting rid of this boat. We don't want to do that work. Coast Guard doesn't care whether it's 1 year or 5 years. This is your 5-year inspection. If you're going to run it another day, you got to do this. And so we needed to run it for at least a year or 2, maybe even 3. It turned into almost 4. We would have still run her, except her engine, the motors, 2 of her motors flashed over, and she became inoperable at that point. And that's when we had to say, and the OLS was coming up in months. So we said, all right, this is no point in trying to keep this one going anymore. We truly got as much life out of the old girl as possible.
Yeah, my sense is that there was talk of retiring it for quite a long time. And do I recall correctly that the Molinari class boats were not as reliable as had been hoped?
Well, again, they were, I wouldn't say they weren't unreliable. It's just they had, well, I think that the term that was used was teething pains. Now, there were some issues with them, a slightly new technology involving, it's not new technology, but new to the ferry, new to the harbor. The harbor's a sort of different animal than ships that are going to sea. We're on a steady run here. We're basically, 10 crashes every 8 hours. A lot of crashing into the pier all the time. And so that's a lot of wear and tear on the equipment, because the captains are trying to prevent the crash from happening full reverse, full ahead. I mean, imagine trying to parallel park your car 10 times a day. And then your brother comes on, and the other half of the day tries to do that 10 times a day. How many bangs? And I mean, it's going to destroy the car. Not to say you've never actually put it on the road, just like city driving's worse than highway driving for the car. And the same with the ships and the ferries. So they didn't get rid of, the plan was, 3 new ferries, we'll get rid of the old ones. And some smart people said, no, we're going to keep this one because it's the only spare we have. And that was the JFK. Yeah. And the delays in the new boats, the oldest class, I think really extended her life, the need for her a lot longer.
So a couple follow-up questions from earlier. I know we're just about out of time here, but Mary wanted to know what about the effect of 9/11 on the ferries. Was that why cars were taken off of JFK?
Basically, yeah. The security needed to assure safety was virtually impossible. And not only on the ferry itself, but having cars, several, lanes of cars underneath the terminal, just, too great a risk to continue to allow happen. So that's when they just stopped all that, fairly quickly after 9/11. This is the engine room of the JFK. She's laid up, thus the sign, men working, do not rotate shaft, just in case, safety first. And just the engine order telegraph is indicated below. There's a round dial just above the computer, brass, and it's got 2 little labels and an arrow in it. And that tells you which way the ferry is going to be going, New York or Staten Island. And that's what you're sitting down there, you're looking at the controls
up here.
You don't know which way you're going. You're like, we want to order a pizza. Well, if we're going to Staten Island, we don't have enough time, so we have to wait. But if we're going to New York, we have enough time to order the pizza and have it get down there for when she comes in on the half hour, and then run out and get the pizza.
That's a detail of a Staten Island Ferry crew life. I'm glad to have heard. Question: if you were to, if you had the power to choose a moorage for the JFK, a place for it to go for this new operation, what would you choose? What are your top choices for mooring the JFK now?
Well, it really depends on what you want to do with it. There are very few options for such a large vessel, because you got to get work done on it. There's, three places I can think of, two places I can think of outside of, in the New York area, outside of the shipyard, Cadell Shipyard. And those piers are things that, so it's probably the biggest problem with any ship owner is, where are you going to tie it when you need to tie it up? As far as a venue, obviously, Brooklyn is probably the most obvious one because there's the most space available and for a public venue when you're trying to get people on board. Manhattan's nice, but most of the slips are so silted up. It would be, take a act of the Congress to mobilize Corps of Engineers to dredge in what are now fish habitat. So I don't know how that works. So yeah, just, in the end, it's wherever you can. And, there's a lot of, there's, like I said, not very many places around for that.
Yeah.
So again, getting the work done is the biggest thing because you got to keep the ship from sinking, and then, putting all the accoutrements of domestic life of the venue on board require, some changes because she was designed for a 20-minute trip. And as many people might remember, sometimes the bathrooms didn't work.
Someone earlier in the chat remembered that the
not a requirement
were removed at some point and never replaced. So the JFK went through a lot. Mary, who is on Staten Island, says Pier 1 on Staten Island for the moorage. There's a meeting of CB1 Transportation Committee tonight, and Pier 1 is on the agenda. If I recall correctly, Pier 1 is over by the Lighthouse Museum and would need some substantial reconstruction to handle really anything. But that's been on the NYC EDC agenda for quite a long time. They're just looking for the money to make that happen.
That would be a nice, a very short move. She's, she needs to move from the working pier of ferry maintenance, and it's one pier away. So it's not hard to, you could, that's an easy move. You can almost do it by hand, but yeah. But the pier itself apparently has got some, you can't tie up to it directly because a lack of places to put the lines, because the dock lines need to be put down deep.
Yeah, there's not much in the way of bollards or cleats at all. And I thought your point about the Hudson was interesting with the silting in and the environmental issues there. So it's a real challenge they're facing there. But for those of us who love the ferries, and this one in particular, certainly hopeful that they will be able to find a place to moor it.
I am. It cheered my heart to know that someone liked the ferry enough to say, don't let it go to scrap, because I can see the thing steaming around, and there's she's got good bones, as they say. I know. I put the bones back. So she's all there. We'll got to get her board and get her to toot her whistle again.
Well, I really appreciate your helping us understand the JFK better, and I'm sure we'll all keep our ears peeled for further news about its next life. And thank all of you for joining us and all your great questions. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you, Angus, for joining us.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure. I'm glad I could bring some light to what is a very thing close to my heart now. Thank you.
We appreciate your joining us. So thank you, everyone. Take care and be safe.